in recent weeks, the Russian casualties, according to Ukrainian sources, which are probably quite legitimate, from what I've heard, the Russian casualties of both killed and wounded together have crossed over 1 million people, which is a pretty significant number any way you look at it. But in terms of actually being able to continue and sustain the war, how do you think that this is more of a symbolic number, or what does it actually mean for Russian future prospects of how long it can keep it going in terms of manpower and personnel regeneration?
Two-part answer. Number one, the round, big, beautiful number of 1 million is symbolic, and the media's grasp onto it, and it's a number that our primate minds like because it's big and round and whole. So that's basically just, it's a number. It's a very big number, but it's just a number. Now, part two, the Russians are in it, I think, a problem when it comes to their fourth generation apparatus and their strategy for fourth generation, because I will argue through trying to analyze the Russian fourth generation strategy that it is not sustainable in the mid to long term. And that Putin will have to make some difficult decisions about where to find men moving forward, because the system is really quite brittle, and Putin has made some very bad resourcing mistakes on how to actually find the men. And we can elaborate and get into that. So that is to say, the figure of 1 million casualties, that's a staggering eye-watering number. It is to a certain extent just a number, however. But at the same time, there are legitimate crises, or maybe not crises, but there are legitimate problems for the Russian fourth generation effort, and the Russian government is going to have to make some difficult decisions in the future about how to go forward with this.
So let's elaborate on that. Which mistakes do you have in mind?
So I'm going to ask you to humor me in going into a little bit of a history lesson, because it requires a little bit of context. And I think perhaps your listeners who have not been following the war very closely, or who are not familiar with Russia's fourth generation strategy, might appreciate this nuance and context. But look, Putin, in our assessment, made a massive strategic mistake in the early phases, like first weeks and months of the war in early 2022, when he decided how to go about resourcing and generating forces for a protracted war. As we know, Putin did not plan for a protracted war. His special military operation was only supposed to be a few weeks or months, if that. He did not plan for a 3-year war or a 4-year war or a 5-year war. Putin made decisions on how to generate forces. What Putin really should have done, and this would have been a sound decision from a military and economic standpoint, would be to follow in the footsteps of previous Russian leaders when it comes to wartime resourcing. In Tsarist Russia, you had conscript slaves who the Tsar could essentially just deploy in a basically close to endless amount of serfs to go fight. And they would be, compensated very, very meagerly. It was essentially free labor. The Red Army in World War II, of course, did the same thing, where millions of Russians, and not just Russians, Soviet citizens, were sent to go fight. And basically, these were massive conscript slave armies. Vladimir Putin is a politically smart guy, and he's a politically actually very risk-averse person. And he understands that Tsarist white army conscription was very unpopular. It's part of the reason why the peasants ruled uprose against the Tsarist regime. Vladimir Putin is a student of history and understands the role that the mother's civil societies that arose as a result of the Afghan war in the late 80s played a catalytic role in bringing about the end of the Soviet Union. So Putin understands that when you use the monopoly of violence of the Russian state to coerce many Russian men to go die when they have no say, that is politically that's a political, hot potato you're playing with in Russian society. And so what Putin did is he established an alternative social contract, which is I don't use the Russian monopoly of violence of the state to coerce hundreds of thousands or millions of men to go fight in Ukraine. I pay you. And so what Putin does is really mobilization is not the right word. What it really is it's large scale payoffs and blood money and bribery. The Russians amended their federal law on military service, and they introduced a new class of servicemen called volunteer. And the vast majority of Russian soldiers that are fighting in Ukraine are, they're either contract soldiers who sign up to know what they're doing, or they're this new class called volunteers, dobrovolцы in Russian. And when you sign up to become a volunteer, you get paid a lot of money. You get paid, firstly, your regular, annual or monthly salary. You get paid a one-time sign-up bonus, both from the federal budget, but also from the provincial, local, oblast level government that you sign up in. And each of the oblasts provide different compensation packages. And then if you're killed or wounded, then you're entitled to a whole bunch of other state benefits as well. And so, by the time that you actually calculate the compensation package for a Russian volunteer soldier, it ends up to be quite a large sum of money. Currently, right now, it's around $35,000, about one-time sign-up bonus just to go sign up and show up, let alone what you're going to get paid on a monthly basis. That's a huge amount of money for the Russians. And when you look at the casualty rates per day, per month, the Russians lose about 1,000 people plus per day, killed and wounded. It's about 30 to 45,000 killed or wounded per month, which the Russians are able to recruit and regenerate. But when you do the math for how much that actually costs, it's a very quick way to introduce a lot of externalities into your economy, which are going to really bugger up your economy. And so this system, this strategy absolutely can work if you're fighting a several month war. Perhaps it could even work if you're only going to fight a 1-year war. But if you're going to fight a 2-year war or a 3-year war or a 4-year war, it becomes increasingly difficult. And the reasons why are because the number of people that are willing to actually take the money decrease over time. And so what you have to do is to go after a dwindling supply, you have to increase the incentives, basically change the demand curve. And so the Russians have had to actually over time inflate the compensation packages, especially in the form of the one-time sign-up bonuses, which you can do. If you look historically, when the Russians first introducing these one-time sign-up bonuses, they were much more modest. They were, in the neighborhood of just a couple $1,000s here or there. But now, the going rate is like $35,000.
Yeah.
Last summer, we reached a peak of $40,000 that was offered by Samara Oblast. It was somewhere around 4 million rubles. They've since had to tamp it down because it was just way too high. But that's a problem. Other issues arise as well. You introduce a very loose fiscal policy. So that means that, you are going to put a lot of cash into the Russian economy, which is going to spike up inflation quite a bit. And inflation is currently a major problem in the Russian Federation. What it also does is, how are you going to finance it? It creates financing and budgetary constraints on the Russian government. So the Russian budget deficit is increasing year after year, and the Russians have been able to get away with it so far because they've been tapping into the liquidity portion of Russia's sovereign wealth fund. But some economists estimate that the Russian sovereign wealth fund, at least the liquidity portion of it, will be tapped by the end of this year, at which point it'll become more difficult to think about how to finance these things. It also causes problems vis-a-vis your monetary policy, because all of a sudden, when you have all this money moving around within the economy and inflation's up, then it forces the central bank to have a higher interest rate. And so the interest rate in the central banking system right now is about 20%. But that, of course, is a problem because it imposes very high costs on capital, which the Russians need to be freely available for the defense industry. Not to mention the effects that this also has on the labor market. When you're trying to find employment in Russia, every single civilian employer has to provide luxurious compensation packages per Russian standards to just compete against the Russian Ministry of Defense or defense industry. And so it greatly inflates what is considered to be a competitive salary just in the civilian market. But then, of course, when you're losing and having killed or seriously wounded 30 to 45,000 people per month. I mean, those are able-bodied men that can either serve in the military or work in the domestic economy, but can't do both at the same time. And so Russia also simultaneously has a labor shortage of about 1 million people right now, and which will only become more acute over time unless they're able to offset it with foreign laborers. But even then, foreign laborers aren't able to do the same sort of work as a, domestic Russian. So, this causes a lot of problems. And, for the Russian fourth generation picture, in the first quarter of this year, 2025, the Russians already burned through all of the money that they were supposed to have for recruitment for the entire fiscal year of 2025. And they got about 90,000 soldiers out of it, which is about 22% higher than what they got out of 2024. They only got about 72 something or so soldiers out of the first quarter for recruitment in 2024, but they're over budget. And so now the Russians are going to have to think about where are they going to get the additional funds to finance recruitment for the rest of this year. So the quarter two figures for this year will be very interesting to look at. Quarter three figures and quarter four figures will be very interesting to look at. But I'm prepared to make the argument and say that Putin's mistake to essentially do what his Soviet and white imperial predecessors did when it came to basically coercing many, many Russians to go fight and die for nothing, and instead now giving them these compensation packages, it is economically destroying Russia in a variety of ways. And it is not just, I make the case, I'm not prepared to tell you exactly when you're going to have a decisive breakdown of the system, because these things are exceedingly difficult to forecast. But if you look at the fundamentals, it's not healthy. The Russian economy is very unhealthy right now. And I would argue that so long as we can sustain the Russians in this system, something's going to have to give eventually. And I think the Russians are going to have to make very difficult decisions within the next 12 months.
If you care about geopolitics, and I assume you do since you're listening to this, you might want to consider signing up to get my newsletter, Station Zero. Once every week or two, you'll get a free geopolitical analysis, a story, trend, or pattern of something that's really important, but that most people tend to miss. Like the one where I describe a chaotic oil war that's been going on between the US, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, that you basically never hear about, but that's quietly shaping geopolitics. If you want to sign up, just click the link in the description.